If I were to point to any episode of Teen Titans that I genuinely don't enjoy, it would probably be this one. Fractured, in which, after failing to outmaneuver a motorcycle-themed villain on his own motorcycle, Robin returns to the tower with a broken arm, content to allow his teammates to apprehend this villain, Johnny Rancid, on their own without him because he trusts in their ability to do so. Sparking a fourth-dimensional imp in the same vein as Batmite, or Superman's equivalent to Batmite, whose name is practically impossible to pronounce, and which I'm not going to even try to pronounce myself, to come to our reality to heal Robin and inspire him to go after the guy again, leading to reality itself being broken when this impish creature, Larry, is himself injured, which in turn leads to Johnny Rancid getting reality warping powers, and somehow Robin is still the one who has to stop him. There are multiple reasons why I don't feel like this episode works. At least not for me personally. First of all, these fourth dimensional imp characters, that particular character archetype, I don't like them very much to begin with. My favorite renditions of such characters have been versions that existed in the live-action versions of DC, like various TV shows, for example, where the budget and the limitation of the medium limited what could be done with them, and so the writers had to get really creative. I know there are probably people who really like the fourth dimensional imp archetype characters in DC who enjoy seeing them in animation, since that's really their only chance to see the character in motion, where they can do all the same unlimited stuff that they can in the comics themselves. But this doesn't feel like a treat to me. This just feels kind of annoying to me because I don't like those characters to begin with. Second of all, whoever wrote this episode seems to have a fundamental misunderstanding of how this character works in general. Like, connections are specifically made between Batmite and Superman's Batmite. Things like Beast Boy talking backwards after reality is broken, or the character's real name being Dick Grayson backwards, since he's supposed to be an outer dimensional duplicate of Robin. For those who don't know, this type of character, one of the ways to banish them back to their dimension, and in most cases undo whatever they did to ours, is to get them to say their name backwards. And he flat out calls attention to that character archetype with his backstory, and yet somehow he's still an alternate universe version of Dick Grayson, when that's not what dimension means in this case. Like, I know some sci-fi mixes up alternate universe and alternate dimension, but that's not what this means in this case. In this particular context, dimension means the equivalent of us versus a sheet of paper. We can interact with that sheet of paper, but if there were some two-dimensional being living on it in the writing or the drawing upon that paper, they wouldn't necessarily be able to interact with us. Higher dimensional characters in DC are characters who exist in the same places that we do, able to, in certain situations, interact with us, but we can't interact with them because we don't exist on a high enough level dimensionally. They can manipulate our dimension because it's so much simpler than their own, the same way that we can manipulate the space within a two-dimensional plane by writing on a sheet of paper, again, using paper as an example. And yeah, sure, Larry could be an alternate universe version of Dick Grayson from a universe where humans evolved in fourth dimensional space, but then why is his DNA the same as Robin's? It doesn't make sense. And it also doesn't make sense that he could be bad at these powers, which should come just as naturally to him as us drawing a line on a sheet of paper. And it doesn't make sense that injuring him could injure reality either. These things, they just don't follow logically from any of the things that we know about beings of this type in the greater DC continuity. And just like some of the worst instances of characters of this type being used, Larry is only really here to facilitate interesting visuals. He's less a character and more an excuse for the animators to go balls to the wall with some of the animation, which in and of itself is pretty great. Don't get me wrong. Like when reality breaks and turns into like a crayon world, it looked pretty cool, and there's this whole like mouth swapping thing where at first Beast Boy doesn't have a mouth, so he keeps swapping mouths with other characters so he can talk. That was pretty funny, and only could have happened in this broken reality where something's very similar to it. But the start of the episode, the first motorcycle chase between Robin and Johnny, was just as visually interesting, so it's not as if they can't do super visually interesting things without this happening. I mean, look back at Mad Mod's episode. They did similar stuff in that, and that was a guy using technology, and it made sense in context. But good animation, good humor, those are the kind of things that can make an episode. And the animation and the humor in this episode are really solid, and Larry's not too omnipresent in the episode. Like, I can look past his presence here. So, end of the day, I don't dislike this episode specifically because of Larry. What I end up disliking this episode because of is Robin's arc in the episode. Robin failed to capture Johnny Rancid when Johnny Rancid on his motorcycle is basically Robin. He moves as freely on his motorcycle as Robin does, swinging from building to building, or jumping from rooftop to rooftop, or in motion doing martial arts or something. Robin failing to apprehend him alone, using nothing but his own motorcycle skills, actually kind of makes sense. Robin, a character who is on a team with other superheroes, should be mature enough to recognize that some people are better than other people at some things. That this guy who specializes in motorcycle combat to the point that when he becomes a reality warper, he warps reality so that he has a flying motorcycle that he can ride and very little else. That's how hyper-focused on motorcycle combat he is. So, like, at the start of the episode, when Robin is content to just take it easy, let his arm heal, and allow his friends, who are objectively more powerful than him anyway, deal with this thing, that was good. It looked like Robin was finally reaching a point in his life where he doesn't feel like he has to obsess over every threat and take charge in every situation. A point in his life where he's okay trusting his friends more and bearing less of the weight himself. And then Larry comes along to convince him to just forget all that, throw it all out the window. And the episode doesn't even end on Robin going out to face Johnny again using his own special skills, like the fact that he's super well trained in martial arts and is basically a ninja. No, Larry just gives him a flying motorcycle too, and for some reason, this time he's able to outmaneuver Johnny on motorcycle. It makes no sense. And then there's the fact that turning Johnny back to normal was as simple as just beating him, and not even beating him completely. They didn't even knock him unconscious or injure him to the point that he couldn't fight anymore. He was just knocked to the ground and stunned a little bit. Like, I don't hate this episode or anything. It's still an episode of this show. There's still some really quality stuff in it. But if there's one thing that I would criticize this version of Teen Titans for, it's the fact that eventually Robin becomes a borderline Mary Sue-ish kind of character. Like, we see that he can hold his own against all of his friends at once in season 1, but that's because he knows them so well. It's not because he's just better than them. And yet eventually the show will start to seem to imply that he is just better than them, and this is kind of where I feel that starts, when it rewinds what seems to be healthy and beneficial character development for Robin, in favor of painting him as the only person who can defeat this superpowered villain. When again, I remind you, he is on a team with superpowered people. So between that and the lore oddities and the fact that they try to remain logical in terms of where Larry came from, for example, even though the episode itself was pretty zany, and yet they don't follow any of that logic up with anything that makes any sense, this episode just ends up leaving a bad taste in my mouth. Like, I don't know if I'd go so far as to say that if I was flipping through the channels one day looking for something to watch and this episode came up, that I would click past it, but I definitely think about clicking past it, whereas that wouldn't be the case for any other episode of this show. But as per usual, guys, I'd like to know, what do you think of Fractured if you have seen it? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord, link in the description. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys. Wait.